Welcome to Murder Mile UK True Crime. This isn't a video, it's an audio experience. The only images you'll need for this episode are these. So close your eyes, open your mind, and savour the sounds of Murder Mile. Who murdered Bernard Oliver and why? Find out on Murder Mile. This is the Heath, also known as the Wheatsheaf Crossroads, near the village of Tattingstone in Suffolk. 4 miles from Ipswich, where it was believed that Bernard was raped, strangled and dismembered. And 82 miles from Muswell Hill, where he was last seen alive. Then either abducted, lured away, or left without reason. With no sightings of him for a week, he ended up in a place he didn't belong. There were no hints that he was held captive, restrained or mistreated, having been fed and given a haircut and a manicure. 2 days before his body was found, and 10 days after his disappearance, possibly in a warehouse in Ipswich, he was expertly dissected by a professional, stripped of any ID, cut into 8 pieces, stuffed into 2 old suitcases, with a shipping label, a set of initials, a matchbox, a tea towel, a sports jacket, and a jewellery receipt, which may have been red herrings used to confuse the detectives. And on Monday the 16th of January 1967, at 9:20 a.m, both suitcases were found, having been carelessly dumped in a hedge. It was a murder which posed more questions than answers, as the police had no suspects, sightings or motive. As why did he vanish? How did he get there? And why didn't he flee? As it hadn't all the hallmarks of a typical abduction, and no one even knew if it was the same person who fed him, then killed him. The Wheatsheaf Crossroads was an odd place to dump the body parts, as although isolated, with no streetlights, few houses, and farmland for as far as the eye can see, there was a real risk of the killer or killers being seen, as nearby was a pub, Folly Farm, and the A317, a busy rural road between Ipswich, the city of Colchester, the docks at Harwich, and many ships heading to Denmark and the Netherlands. A high level of care was taken to ensure that Bernard's body wouldn't be identified. And yet he hadn't been buried, possibly due to several nights of frost which had made the ground too hard to dig, as even Fred Berge, the farmer, had to plough his field a second time. But what baffled the detectives was why the suitcases weren't then hidden somewhere else, instead having been hastily tossed into a hedge of bracken. It was possible, even here at an ungodly hour, in the midst of winter, for a culprit to be seen and then panic. Many witnesses reported alleged sightings of a suspicious man with a suitcase, some weeks, months, years, and even decades later, resulting in cloudy recollections due to time, bias, and facts gleaned from newspapers. But one sighting of the so-called Trilby Man is very credible, as it was reported just 2 days after the body was found, and well before anyone knew anything about the case itself. On Monday the 16th of January 1967, at 1:15 a.m, 8 hours before the suitcase was found, Sheila Fowler, a 24-year-old hairdresser, was driving south along the A137 from Worsted, just south of Ipswich. She stated, "It was rather foggy." Weather reports confirmed this, hence her speed was slow and cautious. "I stopped to turn left at the crossroads, leading to Church Road and heading to Tattingstone village. I noticed a man, about 30 feet away, carrying a suitcase. This was the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. It was cold, and he was carrying a suitcase and was nowhere near a taxi rank, a bus stop, or a train station. He was walking in the direction of Tattingstone on the Harwich Road. I noticed him because at that time of night he was the only pedestrian I'd seen. I picked him out in the headlights. He was middle-aged and wearing a dark trilby hat and a long trench coat. But being foggy, that's all she could see. She'd been spooked earlier in the drive, as a car had been following about 3 yards behind me with its lights on for about 5 miles, meaning somewhere near Ipswich. But at the spot where I saw the man with the suitcase, the car behind me stopped, then turned in his direction and appeared to stop just ahead of him, mere yards from the hedge at the crossroads where the suitcases were dumped. She didn't see it happen, as she'd already driven off and the car was no longer following her. She was unable to identify the car's make or the driver itself as it was dark, and we only have limited details on the Trilby man. Psychologists state any killer would likely remove a body from any place they're associated with, to a space they know but have no connection to, having travelled no more than 4 or 5 miles from the killing in order to distance themselves from any evidence, but also without the risk of a dead body being found in their car. Ipswich seemed a likely location, and this sighting happened 24 hours after Robert Thurston said he saw a well-dressed, middle-aged man with a long face in a long black mac, dark trousers and polished shoes exit the R&W Paul building between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m, carrying 2 suitcases and wearing pink surgical gloves. So was this Bernard's killers or killers? Were they dumping the body in panic? Were they 2 innocent men? Or was this a coincidence? Neither man was found, so we've no way of knowing if any of it was real. But it was plausible, and it may even have led to a culprit. The investigation was thorough, headed up by Detective Superintendent Harry Tappin of the Met's Murder Squad. 50,000 people were questioned, 30,000 homes were checked, 3,000 cars were stopped at the roadblock, more than 2,000 statements were taken, 1,800 calls and 670 letters were received, with 6,000 people in the villages nearby and 15,000 people in Ipswich questioned, with the same done in Muswell Hill. It was thorough, but riddled with the bias of its day. Bernard was raped. Therefore it was assumed that his killer had to be gay. And being just months before homosexuality was partially decriminalised, detectives interviewed every gay man in London. As being the villain of its era, the less educated believed that every gay was a sadist and a paedophile, and as they ran rampant in the streets, no one was safe. Yet whenever any female was raped, the police didn't question every heterosexual male as a likely suspect. It began as gossip when staff at the King's Head in Strutton, 2 miles south of Tattingstone, told police that seamen were having all-night drinking parties in a nearby cottage. It was checked and ruled out, but 150 detectives questioned every gay man charged as a sex offender in the home counties and East Anglia, including anyone who'd been arrested for being gay, as that was still a criminal offence. Rightly, even though there wasn't a centralised missing persons register, police cross-referenced the details of 120 boys aged 12 to 20 who'd gone missing in the previous year, as like Bernard, many were young, handsome, easily led, and were fed and groomed by someone prior to their deaths. Similarities were found between the murder of Bernard Oliver and 14-year-old Michael John Trower. Like Bernard, Michael, who lived in Hove, 116 miles from Tattingstone, came from a good family and went to a special needs school. For no known reason, on the 19th of September 1966, he ran away from home, and a week after Bernard's body was found, his dismembered skull, a limb, a plimsoll and a sock were spotted in a shallow grave at Sweet Hill, an isolated spot not far from the A23 to Brighton. Michael was buried, Bernard was not. But if this was the same killer, had he learned his lessons from other killings to stuff the body parts in a locked and buried suitcase where the foxes couldn't dig them up? Michael's killer was never found, so we shall never know. As was stated, the police interviewed every gay man in London, especially anyone who was famous, wealthy, powerful, or a threat to the establishment. The three most infamous suspects was the East End gangster Ronnie Cray, the music producer Joe Meek, and the pirate radio DJ Tony Windsor. Chris, Bernard's brother, stated,
"I have an idea that the Crays had something to do with it. They used to go to this house."
A 7-bedroomed period building in Bilderston called the Brooks, 12 miles north of Ipswich, where rent boys were brought in. It was well known that Ronnie Cray was bisexual, had a fondness for young boys, that he organised orgies attended by politicians such as Lord Boothby, Jeremy Thorpe and Tom Dryburgh, that he procured for these orgies underage boys, some as young as 10, and that the Cray twins' arrest was delayed,
as 10 Downing Street had told the police to back off.
In 2015, documents released under FOI showed that MI5, Britain's security service, had used the Cray twins to gather intelligence on homosexual politicians and established figures in return for protection. But they didn't purchase the Brooks until 2 months after Bernard's body was found. There was no evidence that the Crays abducted or even murdered a child. The killings they were convicted of, George Cornell and Jack the Hat McVitie, were shot and stabbed, not raped and dismembered. And Ronnie Cray's so-called confession to his former cellmate, Pete Gillett, in the BBC documentary Reggie Cray, His Final Word in 2000, was that he'd murdered a young gay boy. But this only came to light 5 years after Ronnie's death. It's a tenuous link, and as always, people have jumped on it because it's sensational. The next high-profile target was gay record producer and songwriter Joe Meek. On the 3rd of February 1967, 2 weeks after Bernard's body was found, in his North London flat, Joe killed his landlady, Violet Shenton, with a single-barreled shotgun he'd confiscated from a friend. He then turned it on himself. They'd argued over unpaid rent and loud music. He'd struggled with debts, drug use, bipolar and schizophrenia. And after his death, the tabloids fabricated many of the myths which are still used today and mistaken for fact. One was that Bernard had worked as a tape stacker in Joe's recording studio, which is unproven. That Joe had killed himself 3 days after Bernard was buried, only Joe had actually killed himself 3 days before. That he was yet another possible boyfriend of Ronnie Cray. And as a homosexual with a 1963 conviction for importuning for immoral purposes in a toilet, it was suggested his mental state was exacerbated as police interviewed every gay man in London. But given that he had no connections to Ipswich, Suffolk, and he had an alibi for the days around Bernard's murder, why would he be worried? Again, it's tenuous, but it's a more sellable story than Bernard being murdered by a nobody. Besides, neither Joe Meek or Ronnie Cray had an expert skill in dismembering bodies similar to that of a surgeon. The next target of many was Tony Withers, alias Tony Windsor, who was once one of the highest paid DJs in Australia, but came to the UK in 1962 to work as a radio DJ on board the pirate radio ship MV Galaxy. For Radio London, a ship harboured off the coast of Frinton-on-Sea, just 12 miles from Tattingstone. He was questioned by the police in January 1967 about Bernard's murder, and according to Mary Payne, who worked with him at Radio London, he was gay, an alcoholic, and a close friend of Joe Meek. Mary later stated, "We have since discovered many things about the radio station's personnel and associates that have saddened us deeply. It's horribly sleazy stuff." As several 1960s and 70s radio DJs on board the MV Galaxy have since been convicted of heinous sexual crimes. Like Chris Denning, who had a 1959 conviction for distributing pornography, and in 1974 and 1985 for the gross indecency and indecent assault of a child. In 1967, Tony Windsor was dismissed owing to his alcoholism, and when interviewed by the police, it was said that they shared this dark joke about Bernard's murder, stating,
"We are seeking a man who boarded a bus in Ipswich with 2 suitcases. He asked for 1 full fare and 2 halves."
but with detectives investigating whether the initials PVA found on the suitcase could belong to a Dutch national, they had the captain of the MV Galaxy submit a list of all the crew members' names, as well as anyone who'd left the ship and disembarked in Holland. With no evidence, these 3 suspects were never arrested or convicted. But there were 2 prime suspects with links to something much darker, known as the Holy Trinity. In 2004, under the Freedom of Information Act, documents released revealed that the police's prime suspects in the murder of Bernard Oliver were 2 doctors, Dr. Martin Reddington and Dr. John Biles. Martin Bruce Reddington was born on the 26th of June 1931 in Colchester, 20 miles south of Ipswich and 15 miles shy of Tattingstone. As one of several sons to Yvonne and Mortimer, he was raised in affluence and privilege, as his father was a respected gynecological surgeon, and his son Martin followed him, becoming a general practitioner. Records show that from 1962 to 1969, Dr. Martin Reddington lived at 18 Woodland Gardens in Muswell Hill, just a few streets south of Bernard's home. And as a GP who had a surgery on Muswell Hill Broadway, the same street that Bernard was last seen walking along, Dr. Reddington could have been his doctor, but he could easily have just known him, having chatted in the cinema, the laundrette, or the Wimpy bar where he worked. In 1965, 2 years before Bernard's murder, when he was 33, the same age range that the pathologist said that the killer was most likely to be, Dr. Reddington was charged with the buggery and indecent assault of teenage males. But as it never led to a conviction, he remained in his job and home in Muswell Hill. Then in 1971, 4 years after Bernard's killing, with those same crimes coming back to haunt him, before he could be charged, he fled to South Africa and then to Australia. He lived in Marrickville and Turramurra, a suburb on Sydney's Upper North Shore, where he had a surgery and worked as a doctor. There were several attempts to extradite him to the UK, but without enough evidence, Dr. Reddington was never interviewed regarding the indecent assault of young males or the murder of Bernard Oliver. In February 1977, Dr. Reddington was charged with the indecent assault of a young male while working as a GP in Turramurra. And although he made no plea, he was later cleared at Sydney Central Court. Sometime in the 1980s, he returned to the UK. He lived and worked in Surbiton in Surrey, and he died on the 29th of March 1995, aged 63, leaving an estate of £250,000, roughly £500,000 today. When Bernard's murder was reopened in 1977, a private investigator said she recognised the case with the PVA initials as belonged to 3 men who used a laundrette in Muswell Hill. Shown photos of the police's prime suspects, she picked out Dr. Reddington. But this was 10 years later. So was she right? Was her memory clouded by time, bias, and the newspaper's coverage of the case? Or had these suitcases got nothing to do with Dr. Reddington at all? As although the police believed that the initials, the shipping label and the tea towel could be red herrings or a clue to the killer's identity, the suitcases could have easily have been found in a skip and relate to someone unconnected who is long since dead. The other primary suspect in Bernard's murder was Dr. Reddington's friend, Dr. John Biles. John Russell Biles was born on the 27th of January 1933 in Hammersmith, West London, as one of 2 siblings to Hilda and John Biles. Like Dr. Reddington, he was born in privilege, as his father was a highly respected doctor, and he too followed his father, working in obstetrics and gynecology, which is how he may have met Dr. Reddington. And as an obscure nod to the shipping label, he had also worked as a ship surgeon. His history is harder to pin down as he moved from place to place, but he was raised in Bromley, had lived in Kent, Kensington and Muswell Hill, and the same year that he obtained his doctor's diploma, he was charged with indecently assaulting a 16-year-old boy in the Earl's Court flat that he shared with a marketing executive called James William Hulsell. They pleaded not guilty. They both claimed that the boy was lying. And on the 11th of November 1963, at the Old Bailey, they were both acquitted. In April 1967, 4 years later, in connection to Bernard Oliver's murder, when detectives interviewed every gay man in London with a conviction for sexual offences, they searched Dr. Byles' Ennismore Gardens flat in Knightsbridge. They found nothing. But why would they? As with the culprits said to have a high level of criminal sophistication, would Bernard's killer really leave any evidence in their own home? That same year, along with that search, Dr. Byles was interviewed as one of 2 men thought to have been seen talking to Michael John Trower, the 14-year-old boy from Hove, whose dismembered body parts were found in a shallow grave near Brighton. Dr. Byles wasn't charged, and the case remains unsolved. In 1973, both Raddington and Byles were suspects in the murder of another boy in London, and with Dr. Byles being investigated by Scotland Yard for more than 20 alleged indecent assaults, they both fled to Australia. On the 17th of December 1974, Byles was arrested in Melbourne for the gross indecency of a minor, and pending his extradition back to England, his $2,000 bail was paid for by Dr. Raddington. He was due to appear at his extradition hearing on the 27th of December 1974, but instead he fled. 3 weeks later, on the 19th of January 1975, 3 days after the 8th anniversary of the discovery of Bernard's body, under the alias of John Matthews, he booked into a room at the Prince of Wales Hotel in Prospery in Queensland and killed himself, taking an overdose of sleeping pills. Beside his body, he'd left 3 handwritten notes, one addressed to his family in London, the other to his friend Dr. Reddington, and a third to Scotland Yard, in which he apologised for his actions, but he made no reference to Bernard Oliver. He was buried in an unmarked grave in Prosperine General Cemetery. When he took his own life, he was almost broke, unemployed, lonely, and a wanted man. As just 4 days prior, he'd been named at Leeds Crown Court in Northern England as a ringleader in the Holy Trinity. So who killed Bernard Oliver and why? It has never been solved, but is the evidence right there? Bernard Oliver was 17, but looked 12, as he was small, pretty, slim, and as a student at a special needs school, it was said he was easily led. He talked of leaving home, but hadn't and wasn't dressed for it that night. And having gone to a cafe, he told his friend Christine Willers,
"I'm going off to see a friend."
But he never said who. Was he chosen because of his prepubescent looks? Was he handpicked by someone who knew him? Was he gently lured away from Muswell Hill by someone who he truly trusted, who bought him a meal and a necklace for his girlfriend, plied him with cigarettes, and promised to fulfill his dreams?
He said he'd like to work on a farm with animals.
Not realising it was a nightmare. Maybe no one spotted his abduction, because he wasn't snatched. He was coerced by a kindly friend. There were no confirmed sightings of Bernard from Friday the 7th to Monday the 16th of January. So maybe, given that he had no restraint marks to his wrists and ankles, suggesting he wasn't held captive, had his abductor kept him sweet by driving him to Suffolk, where for a week he worked on a farm, earning some money and living his dream, having been reassured,
"It's okay, I've squared this with your father."
this was something only a man of wealth and power could do, having given him food, a bed, a haircut and a manicure, believing he was being treated well, when in truth his abductor had a darker motive. On the 14th of January 1975, 4 days before his suicide, Dr. Biles was named at Leeds Crown Court as one of several men accused of the grooming, abduction and sexual assault of boys, some as young as 9, at the Holy Trinity Church in Huddersfield, West Yorkshire. Having fled to Australia before he could be charged, Biles was described in court as evil and the ringleader in a network of child rape and porn. In the dock, his 3 perverted co-conspirators stood in his absence. Reverend John Fairbairn Poole, vicar at the Holy Trinity Church, Raymond Varley, an ex-child care worker, and Clive Wilcock, a school teacher, who, like Dr. Biles, were the kind of adults the vulnerable children were told they could trust. Biles, who had prior allegations hanging over him for luring young boys to his South London surgery, plying them with alcohol and maybe tranquilizers, and photographing the child's rape, as well as a further claim that he had assaulted, murdered, and cut up a cabin boy when he worked as a ship surgeon, used dark and isolated spaces where no one would hear the children scream, such as the crypt under the Holy Trinity Church. Having been fed a last meal, lured with promises, and given a haircut and a manicure so they'd look pretty, with each child drugged and raped, the Holy Trinity posed them, photographed them, and then sold these naked and explicit images to pornographic magazines in Denmark and the Netherlands. On the 15th of June 1975, Reverend John Poole, Raymond Varley, Clive Wilcock, and Dr. John Biles and Jack Nichols, in their absence, were convicted of conspiracy to contravene the Sexual Offences Act, the Obscene Publications Act, and the Post Office Act, as well as the gross indecency and assault of minors. Reverend Poole denied taking any part in the abuse and was sentenced to 3 years. Wilcock to 4 years, along with Raymond Varley, who admitted to 7 charges of indecently assaulting boys aged 9 to 13. And in the 1980s, he continued to abuse boys in Albania, Serbia, India and Thailand, while working as an English teacher. An extradition application later failed as he claimed that he had dementia, and he died in a Goa prison, aged 63. Varley's close associate was Dr. Freddie Peets, a notorious doctor and social worker for the Catholic Church, who participated and coordinated the international abuse and trafficking of young children. Dr. Biles was never sentenced, as he was already dead, and Dr. Raddington was suspected, but never tried. Even though as a known associate of Biles, they were both suspected of several assaults and murders. But there was never any hard evidence to connect either man to the suitcases or the killing, and it is uncertain and unlikely, given the distance, that Bernard Oliver was brought to the Holy Trinity Church. In 1968, with the murder site still missing, no confirmed sightings, and no evidence against any suspect, the investigation into Bernard Oliver's murder collapsed, and no one was brought to justice. As a cold case, it's reopened every decade or when new evidence emerges, but little progress has been made. Chris, Bernard's brother, said,
"I wish it had been solved before my father, my mother and Tony died. I don't know if it ever will be."
As of today, it's remained unsolved for 58 years, and even with advances in DNA, with Bernard's jacket lost, the suitcase is improperly stored for modern forensic techniques, and if he was murdered at the R&W Paul warehouse in Ipswich, with that soon to be renovated into flats, another piece of the puzzle is due to be erased forever, along with every witness and their memories clouded by time. As Chris said,
"At the end of the day, even if I found out who did it, he might be alive or dead, but it doesn't bring my brother back. People say you'll get closure, but I'm never going to get closure."
Dr. Biles and Dr. Reddington remain the police's prime suspects in the murder of Bernard Oliver, and maybe other young boys who were raped and murdered by the Holy Trinity.